everyone, and welcome to Talk of the Town. I'm James Milan, and today we get our latest legislative update from our state senator, Cindy Friedman, who we always love to talk to, so glad to have you as always.
Thanks, James. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks for coming in.
Sure.
We are speaking near the end of January, and so therefore that means that the deadline for filing all the legislation that you would have been sponsoring, or I guess all the legislative bills, had to be filed by about a week ago or so.
Yeah, the 18th.
So your brain must be full of the things that you've been working on. So why don't we start there? What are some of the higher profile or stuff that you'd like to share with us that you've just filed?
Oh, yes, my brain is full. I'm not sure it's in well-organized buckets, but it's full.
We'll try and help you along with that.
So there's a couple things that I am working on, that bills we filed that are a priority for me. One of them is a parity bill to ensure parity between behavioral health services and medical surgical services. And it's a bill that will ensure that insurance companies are following the parity laws, both state and federal. We know that there's not parity right now, and so this bill would move that conversation along so we could better understand where the gaps are.
Right, so when you say that there's not parity there now, of course, I think what you mean is that there is a lot more turning within the medical establishment to surgical interventions or other kinds of things, and a lot more like insurance coverage for that stuff, et cetera, rather than behavioral or mental health services?
So the law says that there can't be a difference between the services you provide for behavioral health and the level of service that you provide for medical surgical. We all know that it is much, much more difficult to get behavioral health services than it is to get medical surgical services. And that whole area of finding behavioral health services is at best opaque, and at most and more appropriately is a black hole. Mm-hmm. And so we really need to look at what's going on there so that we can direct our insurance companies to follow the law, mm-hmm. and make those services accessible for people who really need them.
And how will this legislation help to push that forward, you were saying?
So the legislation requires a certain level of reporting that would allow the Department of Insurance and stakeholders in the state to see where and if there are gaps between the parity of services. So it's really about enforcing data reporting, because that's the way you tell whether in fact there's parity between the services. There's also areas that aren't, that this would affect, for instance, whether you can find a provider for your child who may be having a behavioral health issue. Right now, very, very difficult to do, and yet the insurance companies will say, oh no, we have a full panel of doctors, but when you call through, I know people have called me and said, I've called 60 providers and none of them can help us. Mm-hmm. So it's getting data, making it available, making it public so that we can absolutely be sure that everybody's following the rules, and the rules are important. So.
Yeah, and as an aside, and I don't want to digress for long, but that is of a piece, what you've just described is of a piece with a lot of other kinds of, within the criminal justice reform area and a number of others, where the importance of data, the importance of making it available, accessible, transparent to, first of all, policymakers, yep. And then by extension to the rest of us. Right. There seems to be a real recognition across the board, in Massachusetts at least, yeah. from many legislators, that of the importance of that. And I think people might find it boring to think about, yeah. Information.
Right.
And yet it is absolutely key to kind of both shaping and wielding effective policy,
Sure.
I would think.
And you know, if you look at and ask for the right information, it helps you to determine what works, what doesn't work, what's kind of working. So if you change this, it would better, you know, you better provide. At its best, it's a really useful tool. At its worst, it can be manipulated. And you know, there's an interesting case where the U.S. Attorney General for our district, Andrew Lelling, came out in an op-ed yesterday talking about safe consumption sites, which have to do with providing a safe place for people to inject who are addicted. And he referred to a report from RAND saying that the data about the efficacy of safe consumption sites was badly done and not, and you know, and it didn't save. It didn't help. And I went actually and I read the report, and that's not what it said. But he used that as a way of saying the data says, well, that's not what the data said. The data said this is new. It's very hard to measure these things because it's hard to have a control site. It's hard to say, okay, you get to do something that may save your life, but you don't get to do something. Very difficult to do. And it said that given the level of the crisis, even if it helps a little bit, it is worth looking into and researching more. And that's what, you know, so that's a perfect example of.
It is, and it's also an example of one other factor that we'll just mention and then we'll move on, and that is the fact that, of course, I, as a consumer of news, in listening to the radio yesterday, what did I hear? I heard only his statement and his saying these are not safe places. And I might agree or disagree, but I'm not hearing anything about the accuracy of that statement or not. It's, you know, there's lots to be done, right, to improve the system from where it is now. Anyway, what might be another thing that's on your mind from recent filing?
Another piece that we are looking at is I filed a piece of legislation with Representative Socolo from Lexington. She's been working a lot on transportation in her district, and we filed a bill together that would allow for transportation improvement districts so that cities and towns could come together with businesses, the state, MassDOT, and provide more infrastructure for local public transportation. And
like Lexpress
yeah, more
right
like
now,
there's one
mean,
called,
or?
I think, Rev in Lexington. So it's a joint venture between businesses and the town. The businesses have they have a shuttle that goes to Hartwell Ave, and they came to the town and said they wanted to do more. And the town said, well, okay, but you need to now stop in the center and you need to stop in other places so that everybody can have access to it. So it's formalizing those kinds of relationships so that they can be sustainable. And she brought that to us, and I think it's a great, you know, it's a great local initiative that could possibly help. Certainly Lexington. Burlington has that same kind of issue, Billerica.
Right, so several of your towns, even though Arlington isn't necessarily
Arlington's very much served by the MBTA, by the bus system.
Right,
so.
we have for the spine of Mass Ave already, and then we also just don't have that, as we've often talked about before, we don't have that industrial or commercial, you know, large commercial base that we'd also be working with around that kind of thing. So
another piece that we've done is a criminal justice piece for youthful offenders. So while there was a effort to try and raise the age for juvenile offenders, it didn't pass in the juvenile justice bill. And so now what this bill would do is ensure that people 18 to 26-year-olds who are imprisoned get a set of services that would allow them to do much better and have skills and deal with some of their issues that got them there in the first place, so that once they leave, they have a better chance of being successful in the community. Right now, the recidivism rate of offenders 18 to 26 is very high, and it's very high because they sit in prison, they don't get any services, they leave, they have no support, and they just go back to what they were doing. So that's what this bill would do, would ensure that they get treatment and services.
Yeah, and that 18 to 26, I'm sure is not an arbitrary.
No, that's what we're learning is that
categorization
brain development and is coming much later than what we assumed. You're not actually, you don't turn 18, become an adult. Then in fact it's a much longer process and for the brain to develop. So so they're still very vulnerable, and especially when you know now that we know the social determinants of health have such an impact. Poverty, trauma, lack of education it plays such an important role in your overall health outcomes. This is, again, this is an area and a group of people that we really need to pay attention to.
Right, and in which one hopes, effectively drafted and then implemented legislation could really make a difference.
Could really make a difference, and
Yeah.
we would be really actually doing rehabilitation instead of just incarceration. So, and it's overall good for our system, right? I mean, when you can put people on a path of recovery and put people on a path of being successful in their lives, being successful meaning being able to manage and take care of themselves, you have a much better society overall and a much stronger economy. So it benefits us all to pay attention.
As you were talking about that bill, I realized that yes, last year we celebrated together the passage of the omnibus bill around criminal justice reform, and I think a lot of people might have thought, oh, good. We've taken care of a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
And of course, from within the State House, you very well understand that, no, there's a lot of additional legislation that needs to be filed. And in fact, that's happening in this session as well. And I know that your own name is attached to a number of the bills. So what else in that field have you been working on, and have you filed legislation around?
Around the criminal justice piece. Well, there's one bill that I filed that I feel very strongly about. So right now, through a court, we have an ability to hold somebody who has a substance use disorder. A court can order them to a treatment facility. It's called a Section 35 because that's what part of the Section 35 of Chapter 123 or 127, I always mix up, of the Mass General Laws, and that's where it is. And so it's called section.
So they get sectioned.
They called section. They get sectioned, right? And this is done through a court. Well, right now, those beds, many of those beds are actually owned by the Department of Corrections. So people hear about MASAC, and those are run by the EOPS, Public Safety, which oversees our prisons. My bill says that you cannot have a program that is a Section 35 program that is run by the Department of Corrections. It has to be run and licensed by the Department of Mental Health. And it's pretty straightforward. These people are not criminals. They're ill. They have an illness. If we're saying that they are a harm to themselves and others, so they belong in a hospital or a treatment setting. The Department of Corrections is not a treatment setting, and it never will be. Totally different mission, totally different issues that they have to deal with. So this bill would say you cannot have those programs within the Department of Corrections. Now, I've heard back from a number of judges and saying, where are we going to put these people if we don't have this? And my reaction is, well, we're going to have to figure that out. But if you had cancer and we didn't have a bed for you, it would never dawn on us to put you
in prison
as
a result. Yes.
As a result.
And again, just to make sure that I'm very clear about this, people who get sectioned, as we were talking about, who fall under Section 35, are basically being involuntarily committed because of their substance abuse issues.
Because they are deemed by the court to be a harm to themselves or others. But only a court can do that right now. So unlike a Section 12, which deals with people who are having a mental illness episode and may be seriously psychotic and need to be committed, that can be done by a police officer, by a doctor. There's a number of healthcare providers that can do a Section 12, but only the courts can do a Section 35.
Got it. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention before we move on to the next thing I wanted to ask you about?
Well, we have a gas leaks bill. That's really important in my district.
Absolutely.
And so we have a bill that is going to require more work on the part of our wonderful utility companies to address gas leaks, and also to ensure that they have the right people in place that can oversee and that ensure safety when on gas works.
Yeah, and on that subject, I know, and just want to share that, of course it's a timely issue because of the very dramatic events that happened in Lawrence and Andover, et cetera, just a few months ago. But I know that this is something you've been aware of and probably working on, and that it is an issue for many more communities than just those that we know about, and that it's been going on for quite a long time now. So really this is something that is overdue in a sense, in terms of, as you say, getting that message through to our wonderful utility companies.
Right.
Great. We find ourselves again at the end of January with, in the recent past, the governor having just released his budget, which you have clarified for me in the past, is just it has no force of law behind it or whatever. It is his set of priorities in budget form. And then the House will provide their own, the Senate will provide their own, and together you guys will fashion the budget that will come out and be voted on. But nonetheless, it is the governor's priorities as usual, and we always want to talk about highlights from that. In this case, many people are talking about the increased education funding that he is looking at, of over $1 billion over a period of, I think, 7 years or something like that, which sounds hopeful and encouraging. Just wanted to get your thoughts about it, because I understand that it's not necessarily seen as pure good news.
So, disclaimer, I have not looked at this budget in great detail. I have barely looked at it.
Just a few days.
And I've just, I've sort of reviewed the highlights, the things that everybody's kind of looked at. So I do need to look at it more. But my first reaction is, I'm not sure what it really is doing. When you look at the amount of money that he's looking at putting in, and you break it down over the course of the years, I'm not sure it comes out to all that much more money than we're spending. Now, again, that's my first quick perusal of it. So, so that was sort of my first reaction. At first you hear, oh, wow, $1.1 billion, and then you go, well, wait a minute, break it down.
Right.
I'm not sure
1.1 billion over 7 years, divided by 300 and some odd
it's like, okay, I'm not sure, I'm not exactly sure what that's going to come out to. So that would be the first thing I would look at. The second piece of it is, I don't understand how this notion of kind of the evaluating districts around their turnaround plans, I don't know how that's going to work. I just, how is that going to, what are you going to do? You're going to say, well, that school isn't following their turnaround plan, so you district, we're going to give you less money based on how much money administratively you get. So that's my second reaction to it. And the third is that we do a lot of things, and we do this with healthcare too. We cut around the edges. We do little things, little Band-Aids. And I think we need a bigger, more integrated approach to solving the issue of the gaps in education that we're seeing, because that's really the issue that we're all trying to solve. It's how do you close those gaps between, urban schools who are, dealing with so many issues that kids are coming to school with, and our suburban schools, which have many more resources, possibly many more engaged people, and so what is really working there? And I'm really for this notion that we had charter schools and they were supposed to inform public education. Can we go back and look at that and say, okay, what was successful here?
Right. So again, returning to that data, to the importance
this was successful
of
at this school. So what can be transferred and why can it be transferred? And let's start to look at let's start to put policy around that. And we do some crazy things, like we have schools that are deemed level 4 schools, failing schools. We give them money and we give them resources, and guess what? They come up. They're no longer 4, they go to 3, and we go, okay, thanks, we're taking your money back.
Right,
Go
exactly. You've
It's
now gotten to a point where
nothing they did had any effect on the, you give more resources, you pay more attention, you have more ability to do things, and voila.
Right.
So I'm like, so I have to look at what the governor's done and say, is this really getting us to where we need to be?
One note that I would make about it is, again, because, as we say, this is an expression of policies and priorities for him. The fact that he's been very explicit about wanting a larger share of the money to go to more poorly performing or just districts without the resources. That sounds like just, I'm glad that he's making a statement. I hope it actually is true.
Right.
But that seems like somewhat of a change to hear, again, the governor saying out loud that kind of thing. And it jives with, as you just alluded to, this very startling article in the Boston Globe magazine of a couple of weeks ago, in which they looked at valedictorians from all the Boston area high schools over a couple of years and traced them out over, I think, 6 or 7 years, basically, to find that these are the best of the best and the brightest of our public schools in the Boston area, and they are, a lot of them are struggling, and it was very sobering to see how these guys fared over time, and again, to consider all of the obstacles that they are dealing with that cannot be overcome, even by all the hard work and diligence that it takes to become the valedictorian, the single person at the top. Right,
and you really begin to see how much of what we bring has to do with our community around us, our parents, our family, our community. We bring that to education, we bring that to learning. And what we see is that there's all this, I don't know if it's hidden, but it's nuanced. And without that, in this particular world today, where you need so many different skills, it's no longer, I'm going to go to high school, then I have a job being, a bricklayer or working in a factory. So now all of a sudden we're exposing, well, what does it mean? And what does it take to be successful in the 21st century? And we're seeing, it's a lot more complicated. And I think we need to be really careful that we don't put all of that onus on our schools. Our schools are there to teach kids. And to a certain extent, they do need to take care of their emotional health and well-being. But at some point, that's not their expertise. And we as a community and a state have to ensure that we are stepping in where it is necessary to provide those kinds of services so that kids can go to school and learn.
Right. And again, it's just so easy for all of us, in the same way as I referred to with the omnibus bill, and people thinking, okay, that's taken care of now. You
it's just
see
the
the
next
story
step.
of a valedictorian or whatever, and you say, okay, great, that kid is set. But no, that's not the case. And again, as a society, we need to be acknowledging and then acting from the recognition that there are going to be things that they need help with beyond that, and that they deserve it. Excuse me. I did want to ask you about one other aspect of the governor's budget, and again, understanding that we haven't given you a chance to look through it thoroughly, and that is, again, because it's come out along with the announcement. One of the higher profile things is, taxes. This Republican governor is including a number of taxes to raise revenues for a number of different programs, and in a number of different areas. Just wanting to get whatever reaction you have to that.
Well, I'm surprised. I think the biggest one that comes to mind is the real estate tax.
Yeah, so this is higher transaction fees, I think, right?
And which could be a really good idea. I'm not sure. I know that there's some concern around the CPA folks, and I think maybe it has to do with the fact that they get their money from CPA money comes from deeds, and so I wonder if they're wondering, Community Preservation Act, and so there may be some concern that now that's not going to. Somehow we're not going to be able to invest in that. So I'm not sure. I know there's some...
there may be some knock-on effect.
There's some being, and I don't, I guess I have to look at that. But I find it interesting. I think that it kind of raises this whole issue of revenue. And I would hope that instead of us feeing our way out of this, having extra this, that we seriously look at our revenue and how we tax, and that we get to the Fair Share Amendment, which I think would certainly level the playing field a little bit.
Do you want to just explain again what the Fair Share Amendment?
So the Fair Share Amendment says that there would be an extra tax that people who made over $1 million in income would be taxed an additional 4%. That the amount over $1 million would be taxed an additional 4%. And it was going to be on the ballot. It had gotten signatures to appear. It is a constitutional change, so it has to go through a very specific process to become law. And when it was being validated for the ballot, it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said they knocked it down because of the certain ways that it was written. So now we're starting the process over. But I think that what the effort will be is to get the legislature to move it along so that it could be on the ballot without going through the whole signature process. Because clearly there was an enormous amount of support for it. This would really make a huge difference in our revenue. Conservatively, it's $2 billion more. It seems to me a fair process. While I don't know a lot about real estate taxes, that may be a very good thing to do. They may be very low. It may be reasonable. And we should look at those things. We have Uber. We had a tax on Uber for 3 years or some number of years. That money went to the local communities for infrastructure. It's sunsetting. I don't know why it's sunsetting. Why don't we continue to do that? They use the roads. They ought to pay, right? But overall, we need a better tax and fairer tax system, and I think that's what we ought to be focusing on as well.
Well, you mentioned, we've just been talking about revenues and the importance thereof. And so I just need to ask you about a couple of very Arlington-specific issues, and that has to do with the fact that In this town recently, new assessments were made, and people have expressed varying degrees of shock and chagrin
Yeah.
about the fact that
Yeah.
there's been an average rise across the town of 14% on people's assessments, and in some parts of town, much higher than that. And between that and the impending debt exclusion for the high school and the override that we're also anticipating coming up here in the spring, Arlington taxpayers should expect quite a hit.
Yep.
And to be digging much deeper into our pockets. That brings us back to an age-old question, which is there are a bunch of folks in town who either by virtue of their age, their income, or whatever, because they're on fixed incomes a lot of the time, they're struggling already, and it looks like there's going to be more pain to come.
Yep.
What to be done?
Yeah. This is so full disclosure, I am an Arlington taxpayer. My property taxes are, wow.
Me too.
Wow.
Me too.
And we really, really, really need a new high school. And we are a very well-run town. We do the best, I think, we get our budgeting process is very well done. It happens over 5 years.
It's very transparent.
It's very transparent. And we do the best we can, given that we have absolutely no commercial taxes at all. And unless we annex, I don't know, Lexington or, or Woburn or a place that has a lot of open space,
just so many towns around us, but not us.
But not us. So it's a problem. And I completely understand people having, being of both minds. I really understand that we need this, and oh my God, look at the cost. So there are a number of things that the town can do, and I think they're looking at it. First of all, we had a bill that Senator Donnelly filed to reduce the interest on deferred property taxes, and now so it allows people to defer, seniors to defer their property tax
without having
to pay an exorbitant amount of interest on that deferment. I have a bill that would ensure that interest stay in place for a year after either the transfer or there's a death or something, so that people have enough time to settle the property,
the estate.
The estate. So that's one way. So you can defer. I know that Arlington is looking at programs that I know that Concord has. I think Lexington has it too, where they, if you income qualify, they put a limit on how much your property tax will be, and then it's dispersed. That extra is just dispersed among the residents, all the residents. So I know that they're looking at that, and that's an interesting.
Yeah, with the theory being, I assume that the number of people in that situation is small enough so that the dispersed pain is not going to be very noticeable or whatever.
Yeah, and with all due respect, if you live in a $5 million house, maybe you can afford a little extra. I don't know.
Even I venture to say, you don't live in a $5 million house. I don't live in one.
Right.
But we can handle that pain, perhaps. I don't want to speak for yourself.
And the town has to look at that, and they have to come up with, they have to show people what it would mean, and then the town, we all get to make that decision. So I think that's a good piece. But it kind of goes back to what I was saying. We are using property taxes to fund necessary services, and that in and of itself is not a working premise. And that's why we need to really go back and look at how is our tax structure working, and what can we do to make it fairer. And one way to make that fair is to increase the taxes on people who have more. And why should you pay more if you have more? Well, we all live together. My security completely affects your security, You don't live in a vacuum, and we all kind of have to pay our fair share. So we have a tax system right now that absolutely works against those who make less. And I don't mean even the poorest of the poor who pay no income tax, they don't pay them. But I would bet that you and I and many people who are, who we consider working families, they pay inordinately more, they pay relatively more money than somebody who's making, who's the 1%.
Right, at the two ends.
They're not this, they're this. And that just fundamentally is wrong. And so we're not saying, oh, let's just put the burden on the rich people. What we're saying is, let's get some equity here, And so I think we need to go back and look at our tax system. And that's why I think the Fair Share Amendment is so important, because it will relieve some of the burden on property taxpayers.
So you could imagine, and again, I'm not going to ask you to trace how that would happen, but what I hear you saying is that should a Fair Share Amendment, pass and become law, there could be a salutary effect on even on the town of
Sure, because
Arlington
we'd have more
around.
money to put into education.
From
So if we had more
funding,
money to put into education of state funding, that would reduce some of the burden on the towns to provide that extra funding. We could put more money into we could change our statutes and put more money in the SBA, the school building authority, so that we would have more money to give to cities and towns for infrastructure, for capital. And that would take the burden off of, take some of the burden off of the towns. So if we care so much about education and it is such a driving force to our success, then we gotta, then we gotta pay attention to it. And we gotta put our money where our mouth is. So, those are ways that it would help.
Okay, well, we don't have a lot more. We don't want to take a lot more of your time, but we've looked at things at the state level, and then kind of zoomed in on a couple of Arlington specific issues, as mentioned. I just want to. I can't leave. I always like to ask you this kind of thing without asking you just for whatever thoughts you might have about things happening on the national level, and particularly the fact that already on the Democratic side, a number of people have declared their candidacy. A lot of women, a relatively large number of women have thrown their hats in so far. What do you make of it at this admittedly very, very early stage?
Yeah. Well, part of me normally would say, oh my God, we're talking about the presidency, please. I'm going to go into bed and put a pillow over my head.
Right, talking about the presidency 18 months before the election, yeah.
However, given my political bent and what's going on, I completely understand it. And I think it's great. I really do. I think it's wonderful that people are thinking about it. I think the Democrats are doing a good job right now because they're out there talking about the policy and the issues. And I think it's great that there are women in the mix, and given what we've been through, I don't think it's too early to start talking about how we're going to get our country back.
Well, I will just throw in that I think this moment is one of the more optimistic and positive moments, because what I fear and what I'm not looking forward, I shouldn't say fear, but what I'm not looking forward to is whenever all the candidates are assembled and they start, scrapping among themselves, that's going to be a kind of lead to a kind of ugliness that I just wish we all didn't have to endure.
That we're not looking forward to.
Yeah, right. But what are you going to do? So let's celebrate for the moment.
Let's celebrate for the moment that we can actually read and say, oh, that's what they're going to do about that. That's an interesting proposition. So,
yeah, and on the policy side, it is encouraging, I have to say, so because people are coming with ideas, which is very helpful.
Right, exactly.
All right, well, before we let you go, just wanted to make sure we're not stopping the conversation, having left anything you'd like to mention on,
I don't think so. I will go back to my staff and they'll say, why didn't you say this? And why didn't you say this? And I will not have said it. But I just, as I want to always say, I love hearing from constituents. If you go on the website and Facebook.
And I think your office hours changed recently? Or?
Yeah, so what we've been doing with office hours is changing the locations and time so it's more accessible to people. In fact, I'm leaving here now and going to office hours at Kickstand. And I'll be there for an hour. And yesterday I was in Billerica and Burlington at 2 spots. And so we'll be having them, in the morning, maybe in the afternoon, sometimes in early evening, so that
so you're
there's
really
more
catching
accessible.
People with different schedules, or allowing people to catch
people
you.
That want, and so we're always happy to hear from constituents. You can always call my office, 617-722-1432, and make an appointment or find out when the office hours are. And, so don't hesitate to call us.
Yeah, well, you are a visible presence in and around town, and and an active presence in the State House on our behalf. So we feel confident and secure in that, and we'll continue to enjoy these conversations, getting updates on what exactly is going on. So
great. Well,
thanks
thank
as
you
always
for having me.
Yeah, appreciate it very much. And that ends this legislative update episode of Talk of the Town. And I'm James Millan. I welcome you to join me next time, and I thank you for being here now.